The lecture hall was silent except for the sharp tap of Professor Nathaniel Harcourt's cane against the polished wooden floor. He was a man who wore his authority like a crown, the kind of figure whose words could crush or elevate a student with a single syllable. His greying hair was slicked back, his black suit pressed so sharply it seemed to cut the air. This was his kingdom, the realm of academia, and in it he was king. Pre-Columbian contact theories, he said, letting the words drip with contempt, are the playground of daydreamers and conspiracy theorists. Vikings, perhaps, but Romans, laughable. In the front row, 20-year-old Daniel Reed sat stiffly, his hands clasped on his notebook. His heart hammered. He had made the mistake, or perhaps the choice, to speak up earlier in the semester about a theory that had consumed him for months. That there was faint, tantalizing evidence the Roman Empire might have reached the shores of America. It wasn't a wild guess. He had come across an obscure mention in an old maritime log, but Harcourt had pounced, ridiculing him in front of 70 peers. "Mr. Reed," Harcourt said now, turning his cold gaze on him, "tell the class again about your Romans sailing across the Atlantic. Let's all enjoy it once more." Daniel swallowed. I just think there's more we don't know, sir. Maps fade, records are lost. A coin here, a shard there. A coin here, Harcourt interrupted me, is a coin dropped by a collector centuries later. Artifacts migrate, empires don't. His voice was steel. The Romans never saw America. To claim otherwise is to spit in the face of serious scholarship. Laughter rippled through the room. Daniel lowered his gaze, cheeks burning. But beneath the humiliation, something hardened inside him. He could feel it. The stubborn ember of resolve that refused to go out. That night he sat in his cramped apartment, the glow of his desk lamp pooling over stacks of books and photocopied articles. He thought about Harcourt's tone, not the content, but the arrogance. Daniel wasn't blind to the fact that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence. But arrogance had a way of closing doors before anyone could see what lay beyond them. A memory came unbidden. The summer before, volunteering at the county museum, sweeping the basement archives. That was when he first saw it. The faint glimmer in a cracked wooden box of soil samples from an archaeological dig in Maine. A coin, weathered and green with age, its edges irregular. He'd brushed it off and froze. The unmistakable profile of a Roman emperor, worn but still visible. At the time, he'd thought it a curiosity, misplaced by a traveller maybe. But something about it had stayed with him. And now, with Harcourt's mockery still echoing in his ears, he knew he had to go back. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, the narrator's voice seemed to whisper in his mind, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Nathaniel Harcourt's life. The next day, Daniel made his way back to the museum. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light as he descended into the archives. The old box was still there, undisturbed. His hands trembled as he lifted the coin again. Holding it to the light, the patina shimmered faintly, but it wasn't the coin alone that caught his breath. It was what lay beneath, embedded in the hardened soil. A small fragment of pottery, its glaze faintly patterned in a style he had only ever seen in Roman artifacts. The ember inside him flared. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniel could hardly sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the coin's tarnished surface, the faint pattern on the pottery shard, and Harcourt's mocking smile. By morning, his exhaustion had given way to determination. He skipped breakfast, grabbed his satchel, and made his way straight back to the museum. The county museum wasn't grand. A 2-story brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Most visitors wandered through for the Revolutionary War exhibits or the glass cases of Native American arrowheads. The basement archives, where Daniel spent most of his volunteer hours, were the kind of place only a handful of people ever saw. Mrs. Avery, the elderly archivist, looked up from her desk as Daniel walked in. "Back again so soon? You're not on the schedule today." "I know," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice even. "I just remembered something I wanted to check in the soil sample collection from the Turner dig, 1984. Her thin eyebrows rose. "That's an odd request. What's your interest?" Daniel hesitated. He couldn't tell her everything, not yet. "Just a hunch," he said. "You know me. Can't let go of something once it gets stuck in my head." Mrs. Avery sighed, but waved him through. "Fine, but no rearranging. I like knowing where everything is." In the dimly lit archive room, Daniel crouched beside the box. This time he was prepared. He'd brought a small, soft, bristled brush and a magnifying glass. Carefully, he teased loose a few more clumps of hardened soil. Another glint caught his eye, smaller than the coin, but with the unmistakable curve of metal. He pried it free and held it up to the light. His breath caught. It was a bronze fibula, a Roman brooch, its design almost identical to ones he'd seen in reference books. The pin was missing, but the ornate clasp remained, decorated with a swirl motif. "This doesn't belong here," he murmured aloud. His mind raced. The Turner dig had been catalogued as a Native American coastal settlement site, dating back to somewhere between the 8th and 11th centuries. The presence of European artifacts that old was already rare, but Roman? Unthinkable. Unless... He sat back, closing his eyes for a moment. Could the Romans have reached this shore? Could traders or explorers have left behind small tokens centuries before Columbus? It would explain the oddity. And yet, the implications would cause an academic earthquake. Daniel knew exactly what Harcourt would say. Impossible, contamination D, misidentification. But what if there were more? Enough to silence even him? He decided to check the original dig notes. The files were dusty and brittle, typed on yellowed paper. He flipped through pages of diagrams and item lists, mostly stone tools, shell beads, and pottery shards, but in the margins he spotted something curious. Stray coin, bronze, non-native, set aside, possibly colonial contamination. His heart skipped. They'd found it back then, but dismissed it without testing. In that moment, Daniel made a silent vow. He wouldn't just prove Harcourt wrong, he would force him to acknowledge it. The humiliation Daniel had endured in that lecture hall would pale in comparison to the reckoning to come. Still holding the fibula, he felt the weight of history in his palm. He didn't know yet that this was only the first step, that what lay buried in the ground miles away would shatter more than just Harcourt's pride. The real journey hadn't even begun. Daniel returned to his apartment with the fibula wrapped carefully in a clean handkerchief, the coin tucked beside it. He set them gently on his desk, under the glow of his desk lamp, and just stared. The two objects seemed to radiate an almost magnetic pull, as though daring him to uncover their story. He pulled out his laptop and began combing through every archaeological database he could access, comparing the fibula's design to known examples. Within an hour, he had his match, a Type D Roman fibula dated between 50 BCE and 100 CE, most commonly found in coastal settlements of the Western Mediterranean. Its swirl motif was typical of pieces worn by soldiers or traders. Daniel leaned back, heart racing. A fibula like this didn't just appear on the coast of Maine by accident. And with the coin, minted under Emperor Hadrian, if his eyes didn't deceive him, the pattern was impossible to ignore. But patterns needed proof. More than two artifacts could be explained away by chance or contamination. He needed context, soil dating, cross-referencing with the original excavation site, maybe even returning there himself. The thought stirred a mixture of excitement and dread. The Turner-Dig site had been long abandoned, reclaimed by grass and wild coastal winds. The museum had no budget for another survey, and Harcourt's department certainly wouldn't support him. If he went, it would have to be on his own. Still, the pull was irresistible. Over the next week, Daniel spent his evenings buried in the museum's microfilm records, tracing the excavation's history. He noted the depth at which the coin had been found. 3 feet down, in a layer containing early pottery and charcoal remnants. That depth was significant. If the coin had been dropped centuries later, it wouldn't have been buried so deeply among undisturbed layers. One night, while poring over the excavation maps, he found something else, a mention of unusual ceramic fragments dismissed at the time as trade goods from post-Columbian contact. The description, thin, wheel-thrown with a reddish slip, matched Roman amphora pottery almost perfectly. Daniel's pulse quickened. Amphorae were storage jars used for transporting goods like wine and olive oil. Exactly the sort of cargo Roman traders might have brought across the sea. His thoughts spiraled into possibilities. A ship blown off course by a storm, a scouting voyage meant to find new resources, a stranded crew leaving traces before vanishing into the pages of unwritten history. The more he considered it, the more he saw the threads connecting. But he also knew the danger. In academia, a theory without enough evidence was worse than silence. Harcourt would not only reject it, he'd make Daniel an example again, crushing his credibility for good. Late one evening, as Daniel sorted through the last of the soil samples in the archive, his brush uncovered something else, a small, corroded ring. He lifted it, squinting. The design was simple but deliberate. A narrow band with a faint engraving of what looked like a dolphin. He froze. The dolphin was a common Roman maritime symbol, often associated with naval expeditions. It was the third artifact. 3 pieces, all unmistakably Roman, all buried together. Daniel exhaled slowly, gripping the ring in his fist. This was no accident. The weight of his resolve settled fully on his shoulders. Harcourt might think him a fool, but Daniel knew what he had to do. Find the truth, no matter the cost. Even if it meant digging through centuries of soil and arrogance alike. He didn't yet realize that each artifact he unearthed was another nail in the coffin of the professor's certainty, and that soon the excavation would become a battle not just for history, but for the right to speak it. By the time the semester's midterm season rolled around, the whispers had already begun. A few students in the archaeology department had heard about Daniel's Roman trinkets, and the gossip made its way, inevitably, to Professor Harcourt. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Harcourt's lecture had just ended when he stopped Daniel at the doorway. His smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Reed," he said, voice dripping with faux politeness, "I hear you've been playing at being an archaeologist in our dear county museum." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I've been following up on something I found, yes." "Something you think you found," Harcourt corrected, the smile hardening. "And you've been telling people it's Roman." Daniel's fingers tightened around the strap of his satchel. "It is Roman. A coin, a fibula, a ring, all from the same soil layer as pre-Columbian pottery." A chuckle escaped the professor's throat, sharp as glass. "3 pieces, Mr. Reed? That's your smoking gun?" "Contamination is a far more plausible explanation." Daniel didn't flinch. "Then test it. Date the soil. Analyze the corrosion. If you're right, you've got nothing to lose." Harcourt's eyes glittered. "Very well, let's give the department a show. 2 weeks from now, I'll schedule an open seminar. You bring your little collection, and we'll let the evidence speak." It wasn't an invitation, it was a challenge. And Daniel knew exactly what Harcourt intended, to dismantle him in front of faculty and students alike. That night, in the solitude of his apartment, Daniel replayed the conversation over and over. He could almost hear Harcourt's voice already declaring the verdict. Inconclusive, contaminated, amateur work. And yet the professor had made one mistake. He'd given Daniel time. Daniel spent every spare moment preparing. He photographed each artifact under high resolution, documenting every scratch and groove. He took microscopic samples of the soil clinging to the fibula and ring, sealing them in sterile bags. And when the museum director reluctantly gave permission, he borrowed the artifacts to show at the seminar. Still, doubts gnawed at him in the quiet hours. What if Harcourt was right? What if the artifacts were modern intrusions, lost by some wandering collector centuries after the Romans were gone? It would all collapse. And Harcourt would have the satisfaction of burying him academically. It was during one of those late-night spirals that an unexpected message arrived in his inbox. The subject line read, "Turner Dig, 1984. We need to talk." The sender was Dr. Malcolm Fry, a retired archaeologist Daniel had only read about in old department newsletters. He was credited with leading several coastal digs in the 1970s and 80s before abruptly retiring. The message was short. "I heard about your find. I saw the same thing once, and they buried it. Meet me." Daniel stared at the words, heart pounding. If Fry was telling the truth, then Daniel's discoveries weren't isolated, and there might be more waiting to be uncovered. He typed back a quick reply, agreeing to meet the next day at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. As he hit send, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration coursed through him. The gauntlet had been thrown, the battle lines drawn. Harcourt thought this was a game he controlled, but Daniel could feel the tide shifting. And somewhere in the shadows of the past, the truth was stirring. The cafe was almost empty when Daniel arrived the next morning. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and rain on pavement. In the far corner, a man in his late 60s sat with a steaming cup of black coffee, his posture stiff despite the casual setting. His hair was a shock of white, his face weathered, but his pale blue eyes were sharp and watchful. "Mr. Reed," he said, as Daniel approached. His voice was low, almost cautious. Sit. Daniel slid into the seat across from him. Dr. Fry, you said you've seen something like what I found? Fry glanced around the cafe before leaning in. In '84, I was working the Turner site with a small crew, coastal dig. We were mapping the settlement layers when one of my assistants turned up a bronze clasp, almost identical to what you've described. Same depth, same soil layer. A day later, we found a coin. Roman. Very worn, but unmistakable. Daniel's pulse spiked. And? What happened to them? They're gone, Fry said, flatly. Before we could send them for analysis, the State Historical Office sent 2 men. They boxed up the artifacts and told me contamination was the official conclusion, ordered me to strike them from the catalogue. Ordered? Daniel echoed. Fry nodded. Funding threats, the whole department was under pressure. Anything that contradicted the accepted narrative wasn't worth the risk. So I retired early. I kept my mouth shut for 30 years, until I heard about you. Daniel sat back, absorbing the weight of the confession. Why now? Fry's eyes narrowed. Because you've got something I didn't have. The nerve to stand in front of that department and refuse to be silenced. And because if Harcourt is the one tearing you down, you'll need more than 3 artifacts to survive it. Daniel's mind raced. You know where more could be found, don't you? A flicker of something, hesitation, maybe fear, crossed Fry's face. The Turner site isn't the only one. A few miles south, near Gull's Cove, there's a cliffside cut where storms sometimes expose deeper layers. I saw amphora shards there once, before the tide covered them again. The idea of an untouched site sent a rush of adrenaline through Daniel. We need to go there, before the seminar. Fry gave a slow, almost grim smile. I thought you'd say that, but it won't be easy, The cove's only accessible at low tide, and the fall storms are coming in. You'll have 1 shot, maybe 2. For the rest of the hour, Fry sketched a crude map on a napkin, marking out the safest route and the areas worth checking. As Daniel tucked the napkin into his satchel, Fry's expression turned serious. One more thing, if you find something undeniable, be ready for the blowback. Harcourt's pride is one thing, but when you challenge the foundation of an entire field, you make enemies you can't see. Daniel met his gaze. Then I'll just have to make sure the truth is too loud to bury. When he stepped back into the drizzle outside, the napkin felt like a key in his pocket, not just to Gull's Cove, but to a fight far bigger than he'd realized. And in 2 weeks, that fight would spill into the open. The wind off the Atlantic was sharp enough to sting Daniel's cheeks as he and Dr. Fry made their way down the rocky slope toward Gull's Cove. The tide was at its lowest point, revealing a narrow strip of slick, dark sand littered with kelp. Waves hissed and retreated, leaving behind glistening trails of foam. "This way!" Fry called over the sound of the surf, pointing toward a jagged opening in the cliff face. It wasn't much more than a split in the rock, half hidden by a tangle of driftwood, but Daniel could see where the storm-swollen waves had eroded layers of earth. They worked quickly, knowing the water would rise within the hour. Daniel dug with a small trowel while Fry brushed away loose sand, each movement careful and deliberate. Within minutes, Fry's brush uncovered a shard of pottery the size of a palm, curved, reddish, and faintly ridged. Daniel's breath caught as he recognized the form, part of a Roman amphora neck. "Careful," Fry warned, passing it to Daniel. The broken edge was smooth with age, and faint traces of pitch clung to the inside. The sealant Romans had used to waterproof jars carrying oil or wine. But the real shock came moments later when Daniel's trowel struck something solid. He dug gently, clearing sand until a greenish metal disc emerged, a coin, its edges jagged, but the faint profile of an emperor still visible beneath centuries of corrosion. "That's Hadrian again," Fry murmured. "You see the laurel wreath, the same as yours from the museum." Daniel's pulse raced. 2 coins, separated by miles, both buried in untouched layers centuries old. It wasn't contamination anymore, but it was a pattern. They kept going, their fingers numb in the cold. Fry's eyes suddenly widened as he brushed away another layer of silt. Embedded in the clay was something that didn't belong. An iron blade, its handle rotted away, but its form unmistakable. A Roman pugio, the short dagger carried by soldiers. Daniel's breath fogged in the air. "This is it, Malcolm. This is the proof." Fry shook his head, a shadow of caution in his voice. "It's strong, yes, but proof is only proof when you can force them to look at it. The moment you show this, they'll demand chain of custody records, testing, authentication. And if they can't bury the evidence, they'll try to bury you." Daniel met his gaze. "Then we get it tested before the seminar, independent lab, sealed results." Fry nodded reluctantly. "You've got 3 days before the weather turns. Make them count." They packed the finds carefully into sealed bags, labeling each with the GPS coordinates and depth. As they climbed back toward the car, Daniel glanced over his shoulder at the waves surging toward the cliff. Within minutes, the entrance was gone, swallowed by the tide. He couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stolen something back from time itself, and that the tide wasn't the only thing that would rise against him. The artifacts in his pack weren't just history. They were a direct challenge to Harcourt's authority and the academic wall built to keep certain truths out, and in less than 2 weeks that wall would have to face the first crack. The lecture hall was packed, every seat filled, and students lining the walls. Word had spread fast. This wasn't just a seminar anymore, it was a showdown. Professor Harcourt stood at the podium in his immaculate suit, a faint, confident smirk on his face. His cane rested against the lectern, a silent symbol of his authority. At the front table, Daniel arranged his artifacts with meticulous care. The 2 coins, the bronze fibula, the dolphin ring, the amphora shard, and the corroded pugio. Each sat in its own labelled case, accompanied by printed photographs and a small stack of sealed documents from the independent testing lab. The faint murmur in the room quieted as Harcourt tapped the microphone. "Today," he began, "Mr. B. Reed will attempt to present what he believes is evidence of Roman contact with the Americas. As scholars, we are here to examine the facts dispassionately, though I expect we will find a much simpler explanation." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Harcourt gestured to Daniel. "Mr. Reed, the floor is yours." Daniel's heart pounded, but his voice was steady. 2 weeks ago, Professor Harcourt told me that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I agree, but that's why I haven't come here with stories or speculation. I've come with artifacts, verified by independent analysis and excavated from sealed, undisturbed layers dated between 700 and 900 CE. He held up the first coin, projecting its magnified image on the screen. "Hadrian, Roman Emperor, circa 120 CE, found 3 feet below the Turner-Dig settlement layer." Gasps rippled through the room. He moved to the fibula, then the dolphin ring. Describing their designs and confirmed metallurgy reports, showing Roman alloy compositions. He presented the amphora shard, its chemical residue matching Roman olive oil, and finally the pugio, tested and confirmed as 1st century CE ironwork. These were not surface finds, Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. They were buried alongside artifacts from pre-Columbian Native American settlements. The soil dating is clear. The contamination theory doesn't hold. Harcourt leaned forward. And how do you explain this fantastical theory of Romans crossing an ocean they had no knowledge of? Daniel met his gaze. We don't need to prove the exact route today, we only need to prove they were here. The how comes later. But the artifacts are real, the context is real, and the evidence is in front of you. The room was silent. Then a voice from the back, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a respected historian, broke the stillness. If this data is accurate, Professor Harcourt, it changes everything. All eyes turned to Harcourt. His lips were pressed into a thin line. For the first time, his certainty faltered. Daniel didn't gloat. He simply gestured to the display. The evidence speaks for itself. When the session ended, the crowd swarmed the table, snapping photos and peppering Daniel with questions. Harcourt remained seated, staring at the artifacts as though trying to will them into fiction. But no matter how much he stared, the truth was there, solid, undeniable, and centuries older than his pride. 3 months later, winter sunlight spilled through the frosted windows of the County Museum's main hall. The air buzzed with quiet voices and the soft shuffle of footsteps. In the center of the room, beneath a glass display case, lay the artifacts that had ignited one of the most heated debates in modern archaeology: the coins, the fibula, the ring, the amphora shard, and the pugio. A bronze plaque read, "Roman Contact in Pre-Columbian America, the Reed Fry Collection." Daniel stood a few steps back, hands in his coat pockets, watching visitors lean in to examine the pieces. Some whispered in awe, others frowned skeptically. That was fine. Skepticism meant people were thinking, asking questions, not dismissing history out of hand. A familiar sound. The rhythmic tap of a cane echoed behind him. He turned to see Professor Harcourt, looking older than Daniel remembered. His posture slightly stooped. The arrogance that once radiated from him had dimmed, replaced by something quieter. "Mr. Reed," Harcourt said, stopping beside him. "Or should I say, Mr. Reed, co-curator of a museum exhibit?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Titles don't matter. The evidence does." Harcourt's gaze lingered on the display case. "I was wrong. Not just about the artifacts, but about you. I let my certainty blind me." He hesitated, then extended his hand. "You've done something remarkable. I hope you keep doing it." Daniel shook his hand, feeling the weight of the moment. "Truth has a way of surfacing, Professor, even if it has to wait a couple thousand years." They stood in silence for a moment, watching a young boy press his hands against the glass, wide-eyed at the idea that Romans might have walked the same shores he did. Later, as Daniel stepped outside into the crisp air, he thought about the path that had led him here. The humiliation in the lecture hall, the hours alone in the archives, the mud and cold of Gull's Cove, the tension of the seminar. Every step had been a battle against pride, doubt, and fear. In the end, it wasn't just about proving the Romans had reached America. It was about proving that curiosity mattered more than reputation, that the pursuit of truth demanded humility, and that the voices willing to challenge the loudest authority could still be heard. as he walked down the museum steps. The low winter sun caught the glass case inside, making the artifacts glint like small embers. Reminders of a history once buried, now brought into the light. If this story touched you, the narrator's voice might have said, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph. The lesson was clear, and Daniel carried it with him. The truth may be fragile, but it's never powerless.